Good morning, everyone. Welcome to today's episode of Jewel TV. This is episode 24, and I'm Julia Kelleher, broadcasting to you live from Bend, Oregon, here in our temporary studio space while we still wait for our permanent space to be completely remodeled, where we, of course, will have a very cool broadcast studio from there as well. So anyway, happy to be with you this morning. I wanted to talk to you a little bit about more of a creative endeavor and a technical endeavor with your equipment and your gear and your files today, rather than business stuff, which is what we typically do. So today's episode is all about banding, and I'm sure you guys have experienced banding in your files. We're going to talk about what it is, how to get rid of it, and how to prevent it. Banding has been my nemesis for years. As most of you know, I love to shoot on seamless paper. And that is just a recipe for getting that streaky digital banding across your backgrounds that is sometimes almost impossible to see in the files, yet you order a print and lo and behold, there it is. Ugh, and you got to reprint, and sometimes you reprint and it still doesn't go away. So banding has cost me a lot of money over the years. I'm sure it has you too. Banding is something that I sit here and look at my screen trying to figure out if I can see it, tilting it back and forth. I'm sure you've all done the same thing. And it can be extremely, extremely frustrating. So today, let me go ahead and share my screen, and we'll talk more about this thing called banding and get you on track to at least controlling your files a little bit better, and helping you to at least not cost you so much money when you go to print stuff. And as for that matter, when you show them on Facebook, that compression makes the banding get even worse in the background sometimes. So we'll talk about what it is, how to avoid it, and sometimes how you can actually fix it as well. So welcome to Jewel TV, episode number 24, brought to you, of course, by Jewel TV. And you can go to jewel-tv.com to see this afterwards if you missed the live broadcast. And of course, you can get the freebie download, which we're going to give away something very cool today. So stay tuned for that. You can also see the archives and download the freebies from previous episodes of Jewel TV as well. So to do that, what you're going to end up doing is you'll go to jewel-tv.com and you'll see a place to opt in to get access to the freebies. And once you opt in once, you will have an account with us, and you'll be able to log in and see previous episodes anytime you want. Let's get to the real business of today, how to avoid banding in your files. Okay, so first of all, we got to talk about what banding is and why you need to worry about it. Well, banding is digital artifacting. It's like these rainbow-colored streaks. Sometimes they're cyan, sometimes they're magenta, sometimes they're green, that you see either in really crystal clear blue skies of images you shoot outside, or you'll see it in a seamless paper background if you shoot in studio. It tends to affect seamless paper heavily. And of course, it affects blue skies heavily. So what it is in this file, there's actually a lot of banding, and it's hard to see all the time, but this is one of my older images. I didn't do much to it. I just basically kind of processed it to allow the banding to come out. But if you look on the right side of the image, you'll see a little bit of magenta and cyan streaks. And I kind of highlighted it with my brush tool and drew over the top of some of the streaks that I'm seeing in the file. Now, like I said, it's not always obvious. Sometimes you'll process your images, compress it to a JPEG, send it off to the lab, and then you get the print back and you're like, oh my gosh, what just happened? And you'll see these streaks across your image in the print, which is probably the most frustrating thing because you're on a deadline to produce work for clients. You didn't see it in the files when you sent it off to the lab, yet you get the print back and there's these horrible digital artifacting. Well, the way to see it is to apply what's called a solar curve to your images. And this is actually our freebie today. So if you log into jewel-tv.com to this episode, once we're all done and over with here and we get everything uploaded, you will get the free download of the Photoshop action we use to apply this curve onto your images. And it's a layered thing, so it's not a permanent part of your image. It's just a layer on top of what you've already done, but it will allow you to see the banding. And I don't know if you can see up there by his head where the orange off the background, you can see these lines, these curved lines that come out of his head. That is banding. You can also see it down below his camera left side and also on the camera right side. You can see this horrible streaky digital artifacting that occurs there. And I've kind of drawn some circles here to show you where it is. If you printed this file, it would show up in your backgrounds as these like magenta, green, cyan colored streaks across your background. So one of the things that we need to learn is, why does this actually happen in your files? Well, typically it happens during compression. It happens when your camera is going from a RAW file to a JPEG. It happens when the camera or the software, particularly Photoshop, is trying to get rid of some pixels because it looks at them as redundant. So when it sees this smooth colored background as a gradient, it goes, oh, I can drop some of these pixels to create the compression that I need to make to turn a file from a RAW file to a JPEG, okay? So, and it can't make that gradient smooth because literally it's dropping out data. So it's an error that happens during compression when the software tries to remove pixels to compress that it thinks it doesn't need. And so when that happens, you get this banding. And sometimes banding can happen actually literally in the RAW file, but more often than not, it happens because files are over-processed. So contrast is applied too much on a file that has a smooth, like seamless paper background, or you apply an action that has a lot of stuff going on to the file, and that like makes things go all weird and funky banded. So the trick is to actually see it in your files. So we're gonna go ahead and I'm gonna show you how to avoid the banding. Hang on, my mouse is going, I can't see where you are. I can't see where my mouse is at the moment. Isn't that weird? There we go. Let's go ahead and escape. Back to, there we go. Now I can stop sharing and actually show you what I'm going to do. Okay, so now what I want to do is I want to take a file and show you how to use the solar curve to see banding in your file. Super simple. So once again, I'm going to share my screen here and we're going to go into Photoshop and show you what I'm talking about. So this file here, I was actually playing around with. Let me get it to where you guys can see it a little easier. Got all kinds of stuff going on my screen, and I also have to keep my file size or my screen resolution. I have to keep my screen resolution fairly small so that later when we go to, actually, let me close this out. So that when we actually go to process this video that you guys can actually see it. So hang on one second. So I'm going to open a Canon RAW file here. So this is a file that I shot a while ago. I actually shot this at a friend's studio. I was up in Seattle doing a creative live up there, and one of my clients, who is a mom here in Central Oregon, has her daughter who lives in Seattle, and she just had a baby. The timing was perfect, so I borrowed Molly's studio to shoot this family, okay? But what you'll notice here is this file is like ripe for banding because I've got this, it was an underexposed file to begin with. Well, maybe it was, it seems like it was okay, but I had this file. Let's go ahead and reset to what it was shot. Okay, so I had this file that had this potential for banding because I have this gradient going on here in the background. And the reason is because Molly's studio is very small, and so mom had to be very close to the background so you can actually see her shadow being cast on the background here. Combine that with a file that's just even slightly underexposed, and you kind of have a recipe for a little bit of a disaster. So what I did was I went ahead and just processed it in terms of RAW, brightened it up a little bit, made things how I wanted it to look, et cetera, add a little clarity. And then I'm going to go ahead and open the file. Now, I'm going to open the file and process it as if I was not worried about banding at all, okay? So I'm going to go ahead and open the image. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to apply an action to it that I used to use. I don't actually use this action anymore because it does so much damage to the file. Not damage, I shouldn't say. I guess more than anything, it's just, it over-processes it. And so now you can see I've got this file that's already, you can start to see the banding right in here. You see all that? Well, now I'm going to apply a solar curve action to it, and that solar curve action is going to show me the banding right away. And the reason the banding has occurred is because I have literally hashed the file apart by applying a lot of actions to it. In other words, a lot of things were done to the file, so the file is having trouble seeing the smooth gradient, and you can see already the banding is beginning to occur. And if I went ahead and compressed this file into a JPEG, this would be even worse. Like, this would just all of a sudden get horribly banded, and it's actually not even really looking that bad at this point. Let me go ahead and merge the file, merge those layers. And you can see it smoothed out just a little bit. But again, if I put this into a JPEG and then send it off to the lab without doing anything to it, you'll see all that digitized banding in there begin to come out in the file, and that's not what we want. So my point is, to see banding in your file, and it's actually not too bad here, you need to apply the solar curve, because sometimes you literally cannot see it out of camera. So the solar curve is how you can't see it on your screen. So the solar curve is kind of how the tool I use to see banding when I'm unsure, when I suspect it, and I really need to know that it's there before I send the image off to the lab. So one of the ways to really see the banding would be to obviously to compress this into a JPEG format and then apply the solar curve to it and see what happens. So in the interest of moving along here, I want to talk to you a little bit about how do you prevent banding, okay? So one of the ways to prevent banding, let me go ahead and you guys should be able to see my screen here again, now back in Keynote, is to first of all light your backgrounds evenly, okay? So I want to show you my setup here in the studio. This is going to be a little bit ghetto, so you're just going to have to forgive me. I'm literally going to pick up the camera and turn it and show you my lighting setup back here by the studio. So yes, forgive the seasickness here, but that's basically my lighting setup. You can see that I've got my big main softbox there, and I have it on at the moment. And then I have two umbrellas on my seamless paper that are very evenly, and I'll try to go ahead and bring this a little bit closer. We're not exactly have the whole high-tech thing going on here. But you can see there's two 24-inch umbrellas back there, very evenly spaced on the backdrop, evenly in height, and pointed at the backdrop to make it evenly lit. So it needs a little bit of distance away from the backdrop to make sure that things are evenly lit. And then that main box there, that 7-foot Octabank you see, that right there is just lighting the subject. I don't have it on the background at all. I have those umbrellas in the background. That's what's controlling the light on the background to make it even. Okay, so that's trick number one, is to, sorry to make you guys seasick here. That's trick number one to making sure that your images come out in camera to begin with well done, okay? So if you light your backgrounds evenly, you're gonna have less issues with banding to begin with. But even so, that's not the only trick of the trade. Let's share screen again and talk a little bit more about this on how to prevent banding in your files. So another way to do it is to shoot in raw 14-bit, shoot in a broader color space than sRGB. So move your camera to Adobe 1998 color, and I'm gonna show you guys all about this here in a second. And then when you move your files to Photoshop and you start working on them, you're gonna process and edit your images in 16-bit. And most importantly, you're not gonna over-process your files. Too many actions, too much stuff done to the file can rapidly create banding in a heartbeat unless you know what you're doing. So in my Nikon, under the camera setting there, I go to NEF RAW bit depth 14 bits, so maximum bit depth possible, okay? I also set the RAW recording to lossless compressed. So when it records the file to the SD card, it's doing it in a lossless state, okay? So it's not compressing anything. When on my full frame camera, I am getting every single pixel that sensor recorded, okay? Then in the same area, the camera icon, the camera settings, instead of using sRGB as your color space, which I think is the default setting, you wanna make sure that you're in Adobe RGB color space. What's the difference? Well, Adobe RGB color space has way more color information in the file. And that's super important. You want to stay as uncompressed as possible. Some cameras even have Pro Photo color space, and that's super important. Just as big of a color space as you can possibly be in, that's what you want to be in. And of course, Canon has these settings as well. I'm not as familiar with Canon, so you're going to have to look in your manual or kind of figure out where this is, but I do believe it's in the camera icon as well. Just make sure you're shooting at maximum bit depth in your RAW files and that your color space is large as well. Okay, so back to, I'm going to go ahead and stop sharing here. I know this is me going back and forth a lot, but I just figured it would help you guys. So in my Nikon D750, what I do is turn it on first. That always helps, right? Okay. We're going to go into menu here. Come on. Menu, okay? And you can see there, I'm in the color space. Hopefully that can focus. It might not be able to. Anyway, just the same screenshots that I showed you earlier, okay? So make sure you set those settings in your camera and always keep them there. But then the trick is, this alone won't solve all your problems when it comes to banding. The next step is to make sure you're processing your files in 16-bit, and there's a little trick to doing that honestly took me like 9 years to figure out. So here you guys go, all in one fell swoop. So to fix the banding, not only in camera and prevent it, but to also in your files here. Just one second. I'm back to share screen here. It's back and forth a lot, you guys. Thanks for putting up with me. So to fix banding, you want to process, or this is kind of preventing it as well too, but you want to process the files in 16-bit, and I'm going to show you exactly how to do that. You're going to stay in the same color space in which you shot your images. So in other words, Adobe 1998. Ways to fix banding that's already there, you can add noise. You can use the brush tool if it's very light. You can use the splatter filter, okay? And I'm going to show you how to do all three of these just in here in just a second. But the biggest thing you want to do is not over-process your files. I stopped using all actions on my images. I used to use actions like crazy because I wanted that kind of cool look. And on seamless paper files, it was giving me so much banding, so I literally stopped using the actions. Now, when you're working on a wood floor with a baby or on one of those old master's backgrounds, those have enough color information and scattering in the background that banding doesn't really occur that much. But if you ever applied a vignette sometimes to your images of babies on a blanket or on seamless paper, oh my gosh, a vignette will cause banding in a heartbeat. So I stopped doing vignettes altogether because it was too challenging. With that being said, there are some ways to actually help yourself when it comes to banding. So now I want to go into Photoshop with that same file and talk about how we can help reduce banding when we're processing images, and of course fix it if it actually does happen. So yeah, let's go into Photoshop. You guys are so patient with me to put up with me doing all these things. Okay, so first of all, I'm going to go ahead and close this image out one more time, and there's a reason for that. So let's go ahead and open that file one more time. It's a Canon RAW file, okay? So here is the trick. Now, this image was shot correctly, okay? But here's the deal. If I open it right now from Camera Raw into Photoshop, I'm going to be committing a grievous error when it comes to banding, okay? I've done my Camera Raw adjustments, everything looks good, and I really just want to press open image, because now I need to start working within Photoshop, right? Whoa, before we do that, I want you to show you something here. See this? This little information down here at the bottom? Before you do anything, click on that and change a few things. We're going to go into the color space that the image was shot in, and we're going to keep it at 16 bits, okay? If you don't do this, when Photoshop opens the file, it will compress the color space to sRGB, and it will compress the bit depth to 8-bit, which will do what is a no-no when it comes to banding. It will compress the file. And when you start processing the file and cleaning things up and retouching, you're gonna get that banding again. So the way to prevent the banding, or at least keep yourself in a large color space and in a large bit depth, is here in RAW before you even open the images in Photoshop. So again, click the little, it's nowadays, I think I'm working in Adobe Photoshop 2015. So nowadays it's like lights it up in blue down here, but seriously, go down here, make sure it's in the correct color space and the correct bit depth. Then you can press OK. Now you see the settings are different here. And once you set that once, it will be set until you change it again. So now I can open my file and I am working with an image that is 16-bit and in Adobe 98 color space. What I used to do is I was open it from RAW in that 8-bit sRGB and then go up to image mode and convert it from 8-bit to 16-bit here. Hang on a second, there we go. And that was just hurting me so badly because what I was doing was going from RAW to a nice big RAW file in Adobe 98 color space. I was compressing it to sRGB and then also compressing it to 8-bit and then just trying to move it back up to 16-bit. So I was just expanding and contracting like an accordion my file, and that's what was doing so much damage to my files when I was processing them for banding. Okay, so let's go ahead and run our solar curve, and you can see we have potential for banding in here. And if I'm not careful and if I overprocess the file, I will probably end up with some banding in here. So what I'm going to do is go ahead and take the solar curve off, but as you can see, this looks bad. I want my background to be fixed a little bit, okay? I want it so that I'm not dealing with the shadow in the background. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and just do my regular processing. I'm going to do Command-J to duplicate the background. Then I'm going to go over here to my brush tool, make it a little bit bigger here, and I'm going to take this nice light background at 30% and just start painting in. Now normally, if I was working in an 8-bit file, I would be creating so much banding, it's not even funny. Like this would end up being horrible. Now, if I add a vignette to it, I probably would create some banding. There's definitely a fine line, and you can't do everything on a seamless paper and expect not to get banding with these methods. It's just the nature of digital photography. You can see I've kind of fixed the background a little bit, and now I'm just going to go ahead and put in a layer mask here. Okay, a layer mask, and then put my opacity up to 100% by just pressing the 0 key. Harden my brush just a little bit, zoom in, and then I'm just going to remove this off Mama. You'll have to forgive me because I'm working with a mouse instead of a Wacom, and it's kind of driving me a little bit crazy, so I may not be as accurate as I normally am. There we go. So we can take all that. Oh. You can see it's hard to be as accurate with, it's hard to be as accurate with a mouse, but you get my point, okay? So if I really had this issue, granted, this image was not shot the way I would normally shoot. I was in a different studio. I wasn't in my same environment. You know how it is when you get to a new environment, you're like, oh my gosh, this is so different. And I'm trying to do this with a mouse, which is not exactly my strong suit, but you can see what I'm doing here. Okay, so I'm basically trying to fix what is a shadowed background without getting any banding. Okay, so now when I put that solar curve layer on, you can see I've repaired things pretty well. However, we're starting, oh, did it show me? We're starting to get some potential banding right in here. You see that? Also, right in here, I have to be super careful about that, okay? Another way to fix it, let's just go ahead and compress everything one more time, is to do what's called add noise. So again, I would duplicate my background layer, go up to, I love the way Zoom tries to get me to share my screen, etc. It drives me crazy sometimes. Okay, so you're gonna go to Filter, Noise, Add Noise to this layer. And I literally add like 2% noise. It's nothing. You don't want to add a whole lot. All you're doing is scattering pixels, okay? So I use the uniform distribution. I press OK, and that will help. Now you see there's noise all over Mama, and I could mask this off, but if you'll notice, the background has been scattered just enough that that banding is now almost literally gone, okay? You can see before, we had this streaky banding over here, the potential for it up in here, and simply by adding a little bit of noise, I've scattered the pixels enough that the software has to read them all in order to process the file. So what that does is it helps get rid of the banding. Okay, so adding a little noise helps. Again, another solution. I'm going to go ahead and delete this layer so we go back to the banding we had before. Another way to get rid of the banding is to use what's this called the splatter filter. Now the thing with the splatter filter is you have to do it last because your image has to be an 8-bit to use the splatter, to use the filter gallery. That's a Photoshop thing. So I always use the splatter filter as a very last resort, but it does work. So before you do anything, just work on the file in 16-bit and Adobe 1998 color space. Excuse me. And then when all else fails and you can't get rid of banding, resort to the splatter filter. And this is actually a Michelle Parsley trick, so I have to give her complete credit for this. But what I do is I just make a loose selection with a little bit of a feather around the subject. And honestly, you probably don't even need a feather because you'll end up masking it all anyway. So I just use the lasso tool and I just make sure mom is selected here. I'm doing this very loosely, of course, because I'm working with a mouse. Holy cow, this is really bad, but that's okay. You guys know what I'm saying, right? Okay, so basically I have selected mama, okay? And all I'm gonna do is invert my selection so that now the background is selected, okay? Then all I'm gonna do is press Command J to make a new layer out of just the background. So if you see here, I take off the bottom background layer and I have selected just the background here, okay? So now what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna convert the image to 8-bit so that I can use the splatter filter. So now my file is in 8-bit and it will allow me to open up the filter gallery, okay? And I'm gonna go ahead and use brush strokes splatter, okay? So let me go ahead and get into fit in view here. And what I'm gonna do is, this is where you just kind of have to play around with things and see what you like. But what you can do is increase the smoothness or not. It's just a matter of applying a splatter to the image, okay? And sometimes this can be a little hard to see, so you may wanna go down here where there's still a little bit of mama, but you can see that it's actually splattering right there. And if we increase the spray radius, you can see it scatters it even more. You can make it not quite as smooth, et cetera, et cetera. So I scatter it enough that I know that it will take care of the banding. And this just takes a little bit of experimentation. But smoothness, I never really put it too high because it's that splatter, that is what kind of scatters the banding. So I'm gonna go ahead and leave it at that. Okay, now I'm gonna bring mama back. And sometimes you'll notice, and granted I did a terrible job down here, you can see that it's on her, so I would go ahead and mask that off of her. But you just wanna be careful that you don't get it on mama, and you may actually wind up having to mask things to get it to come off of a specific area. So just mask it off mama. Clearly I'm using a mouse instead of an actual Wacom tablet, which makes things difficult. But I think you get my point. And what happens is that Photoshop scatters the pixels, and you can see it helped a lot in these areas of banding, but we've still got it. So you may want to use a combination of the splatter filter, adding noise, et cetera, to finally get rid of your banding. But let me tell you, one of the biggest solutions to this problem is to actually shoot in raw uncompressed format, to stay in 16-bit and in Adobe 1998 color space throughout, from capture through processing. That alone right there is going to help you tremendously with banding. And just using the solar curve action is going to help you see it in a file that you may suspect it exists. That will end up saving you a ton of money before you send something off to print and then have it come back and it's all full of banding and you got to reprint. Or worse yet, your client sees it and then you're like, oh, palm to forehead, got to fix this. So let me go ahead and share screen one more time to go back to Keynote and kind of wrap things up and remind you of how to fix banding when it happens to you. So again, process in 16-bit, stay in the same color space, add that noise if you have to. You can use the brush tool like I did in that first round. You can use the splatter filter, but remember, use the splatter filter as a last resort, because then you have to convert down to 8-bit and start compressing your file in order to actually use the splatter filter. But ultimately, don't overprocess your images, okay? And the big ultimatum is shoot well. Evenly light your background can help get rid of a huge amount of problems in studio when you're shooting on seamless paper, and just with consistent processing and not doing too many things like vignetting or contrast curves bumps or things like that. So really what it comes down to is shooting well in camera is what's going to ultimately help you prevent banding the best. So today's freebie is our solar curve action for Photoshop. So go to jewel-tv.com, access the archives, and you'll see today's episode under creativity, and you'll be able to download the freebie from there. We are just now uploading it, so give us a few minutes to get that taken care of, but that is our freebie gift to you, so you can actually see the banding in your files when it happens. If you're watching this on YouTube in the archives, go ahead and join us in the Facebook group, facebook.com/groups/Julia Kelleher, where we broadcast live on Tuesday mornings at 9 a.m., all kinds of topics from this one and of course to others in business, creativity, inspiration, and motivation, as well as guest speakers who come on all the time to share us their insight as well. If you want to find me, you can go to facebook.com/JewelImages. Of course, we're on Google+, Pinterest, Twitter, Instagram. I am most active, of course, on Instagram, Facebook, and on Pinterest. So go ahead and find us there. All right. So I am willing, of course, to take questions from you all. Belinda just handed me a couple questions this morning before we log off. Jennifer Kenny says, but will the banding come back when we save the JPEG, which is 8-bit? I've always been confused about that. Yes, it can come back. And that's why if you process correctly from the beginning, you can help yourself when you compress to that JPEG, okay? So the biggest thing is just processing, shooting well in the beginning, and then when you go down to JPEG, it'll help you. Now, if you go down to JPEG and 8-bit and you find that you do have banding with using that solar curve action, you can try the splatter filter on your JPEG. You can try it adding some noise. That will help as well. But literally, guys, sometimes banding does just happen, and there's not a whole lot you can do about it. It's an error in digital processing, and that's where lighting your backgrounds evenly is what's going to be your saving grace. So yes, it can happen once again when you do go down to 8-bit. Try those methods, and if it doesn't work, you may, I hate to say it, but sometimes you're SOL. And you just kind of have to run with it and go with it and try to fix it as best you can by adding noise and splattering. And it can be an issue. Trust me, I've been dealing with it for 9 years, and it's so frustrating sometimes. I literally want to put a steak knife to my eye. So be patient with yourself. Do trial and error, see what happens. But if you have to, try to use the brush tool or whatever you can on the JPEG file. But if you process and shoot from the beginning well, you're going to have less issues to deal with when you actually do compress to JPEG. Michelle Gray says, Julia, if you work with a file in 16-bit, do you convert to 8-bit again in Camera Raw before exporting to ProSelect? Yes, ProSelect will not see 16-bit files. So what I usually do is I process large JPEGs and then put those into ProSelect. That works. Or you can make your PSD files go down to 8-bit. I always keep the 16-bit PSD files so that I don't lose them, so that I can actually produce the client's order from the 16-bit file. The 8-bit file is just what I actually show them in ProSelect. Good question, Michelle. Okay, Rosalind Perso says, why don't you use monochromatic noise? You could try that. I honestly have not used it in the past because the methods I've been working with adding noise work. And honestly, noise is one of my last resorts. If you process well, since we've been shooting a little differently and lighting our backgrounds more evenly for the last 2 years, we haven't had a big issue with it. But Rosalind, play around with monochromatic noise if it works for you. I mean, by all means, it's not about the right methods, about what works. Makes sense? Okay, is that all the questions we have, then? We're good? Okay, awesome. I think that's it. We'll go ahead and sign off for now. I hope this helped you guys to at least help you fix the problem or at least prevent it. The biggest thing for me in terms of preventing it to begin with
was the 16-bit, and just staying in 16-bit and Adobe color space, Adobe 98 color space, from capture through processing. And that right there was a huge, huge thing. And then of course, lighting those backgrounds evenly is also what's going to help you as well. So thanks for watching, everyone. I hope you enjoyed it, and go to jewel-tv.com for more archives on all kinds of topics. And we will see you again next week. I'm looking forward to it. Take care and have an awesome week, you guys. Go out and make it wonderful for you and your business.